I saw it as a correction to bad science. Science, which had been based on the normal human male, took the male as the standard in medicine and law and science and so many other ways. And so what feminism was doing in those decades was I saw it as a corrective to biased, narrow-minded science.
You just heard Carol Tavris, an independent scholar from Los Angeles, California. Garth interviewed Carol for episode 201 of Psych Sessions, Conversations about Teaching and Stuff.
Psych Sessions is proud to partner with Macmillan Learning. At Macmillan Learning Psychology, content matters, and these days, digital content matters more than ever. Macmillan Learning's Achieve elevates interactive teaching and learning with an extraordinary range of online course content in a powerful yet easy-to-use platform. Interactive ebooks, innovative assessments, engaging videos and activities, helpful instructor resources. Achieve brings it all together and makes it easy for you to find what you need and what you want. See for yourself. Go to macmillanlearning.com/psych sessions for an introductory tour today. Macmillan's Achieve for Psychology, engaging every student, supporting every instructor, setting the new standard for teaching and learning.
The Psych Sessions podcast is sponsored by STP, that is the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. That's APA Division 2. You can find them at teachpsych.org. The views or product endorsements expressed do not represent the views, support, or endorsements of STP. Psych Sessions is so grateful to have STP as a long-term supporter.
Hi folks, this is Garth, and I want to tell you about an intro psych book from Sumo Learning. That's SOOMO. The book is called Psychology in the Real World by author Jennifer Harper. Psychology in the Real World encourages students learning along the way by providing frequent formative assessments all aligned with APA's themes and learning outcomes from the Intro Psych Initiative, all tagged so you can track their progress on those outcomes. It's got LMS integration and auto-grading and supplements like slides and test questions and notes, and it's affordable at only $50. So check it out. Go to sumolearning.com, that's SOOMO learning.com, and get a preview of psychology in the real world.
Folks, it is my pleasure to be here today on Zoom with Carol Tavris, social psychologist, feminist, lecturer, author. I first knew her as an intro psych author. Carol, you were just telling me something about how you described yourself years ago to someone. Do you want to tell that story again quickly?
Well, sure. I've had quite an eclectic set of activities, shall we say, but no formal affiliation with the university. So someone said to me, well, how do you describe yourself? And I said, well, I guess I'm an independent scholar. And he said, oh, unemployed, eh? And well, that's basically right. My career has been very idiosyncratic, and I'm very fortunate in this respect because when I got my PhD in social psychology, a field I adore. I loved it. I loved it as an interdisciplinary graduate program. It ran from individuals to mass movements and war. And when I got an accidental but extremely fun job at the new magazine Psychology Today, it created for me, well, first of all, it was an exhilarating opportunity, and I had so much fun as a graduate student working there. But it made me aware that there was something that I might be better suited to than being a full-time academic, and that was writing about this field that I loved so much. My beloved mentor at the University of Michigan, Bob Kahn, said, social psychology needs good communicators too. Okay? So I created a kind of idiosyncratic balance between writing about social science and then being part of that academic world. I did almost always have a teaching position because I love teaching. And, but never, as I said, a full-time tenure track route that way. And I was fortunate because normally when academics abandon academia for the, quote, real world, let alone the real world of writing to the general public, they acquire some, shall we say, gentle disdain from the academy for doing so. And I never felt that. I always enjoyed the support of my social psychological colleagues.
Did they appreciate, I know we're jumping right into things, but did they appreciate the way that you were representing and translating psychological science to the general public? Is that why? Had they read things, they kind of understood your role in between what they were doing and what the general public was, that distance to the general public?
Well, they did, because what I was doing is something that is actually not very common among science writers, especially in recent years where science writing has fallen out of favor and most newspapers, institutions don't have given up their science writers. When I set out to report research in social psychology, I didn't jettison the data. This is what a lot of popular writers do. And the goal of being popular, they become very pop psyche, in which they come up with all sometimes cockamamie ideas or just pop psyche things, but basically ungrounded in empirical evidence. And my goal was always to bring the empirical evidence to bear on issues that are so important to how we live our lives. So I think that is what my fellow social psychologists saw. Someone's telling our story, someone's reporting our evidence, but they're doing it right this time. They're not throwing the numbers under the bus.
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to be a theme that comes through our conversation again and again, because I know, because you sent me something recently, you were writing for a website, and I know that you just haven't stopped. Even now, you're retired, right? But you can't get away from it.
No. Stop right there. No. Writers never retire. Are you kidding? Retire? What? We never get a gold watch or a certificate, saying, you're done. Goodbye. Give up your office and no, writers, I'm afraid writers never give it up. Now, retired? What a funny word.
Well, okay, let me back up here and say when I reached out to you to do this interview, actually, Ludi Benjamin was kind enough to make an introduction for us. And it sounded to me in our first interaction that maybe, you just felt like you had said the things that you wanted to say already.
Here's what I have learned in my vast old age about the things I've always wanted to say. Is that you debunk something, and then after a decade or so, you have to re-debunk it. Life is full of bunkings, debunkings, and re-debunkings, and that is the cycle of life. Mm. So many of the issues that I dealt with as a young social scientist, you know what? They come around again, because America is forever prey to social hysteria, episodes of epidemics and, real and imagined enemies under the bed and so forth. There are social issues that simply recur. I write a quarterly essay for Skeptic magazine, which I enjoy. That gives me an outlet to say what's on my mind about something or other. I occasionally still do book reviews, and I've written a book with Avram Blooming, who is an oncologist, called Estrogen Matters, which is really about scientific medicine. Avram is an oncologist, I'm a social psychologist, and both of us have been endlessly interested in what in our field we call the scientist-practitioner gap. That is the difference between clinicians and what they learn in graduate school and what scientists learn about doing research. And he was very alarmed at what many physicians don't know and haven't kept up with. And, that's my theme issue too. So how should I say this, Garth? There's always something. There's always something that attracts my interest, yes. But I don't have a blog. I don't have a regular, online.
Well, I definitely want to hear your big takeaways from your books, like that one. I was really interested in because I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you write to give clarity where there are a lot of misconceptions. Would you say that that's fair? That a lot of this topics you write about is to give a scientific perspective and clarity where maybe the general public has been led astray.
Thank you. That's certainly been my goal.
Mm-hmm.
The first academic book I wrote with Carol Wade was one of the very first books in women's studies. There was no such thing as women's studies then, but we wrote a book called The Longest War, Sex Differences in Perspective. And we wanted to show how different social scientists explain why women and men have so often been at war rather than at peace. But the first trade book, popular book I wrote, was on anger, the misunderstood emotion. People thought I was writing that to, for some personal, who are you angry at, Tavris? They'd say, tell us the truth. You mad at your mother, what? No. I had become interested in that book precisely because the pop psych view of anger was the Freudian clinical intrapsychic notion that anger is in you like a kidney. I am full of anger, and that it fills you up like steam in a teapot, and you'd better let it out or you'll explode or you'll get an ulcer and so forth. And that book was a social psychology of anger. And that's what made it so interesting to me. The clinical view of anger is that it's only in you. And so if it makes you feel better to yell at the other guy, go ahead and yell. And my view was, what happens after you yell? How does the other person respond? Does the other person solve the problem that's made you angry? Does the other person offer to take you on a visit to Tahiti? What do they do? And what they do is a sign of what the purpose or role of anger is in our lives. So I love doing that. That was, I felt, an important correction to the dangerous, inappropriate, and self-defeating clinical notions of just ventilate it and never mind where it lands. And so there was a lot of research, a lot of really interesting research from anthropology and physiology and social psychology and clinical psychology, family and marriage counseling and so forth to make this book distinctive in the anger world. And then what followed in its wake was more of a cognitive behavioral understanding of anger. Therapists stopped having their clients, well, not all, many cognitive therapists stopped having their clients hit each other with bats, which for some reason was not happy for many of those participants. But so yes, my work ever since has shared that goal of bringing the best psychological science we have to deal with issues of such deep importance to people. And of course, my book with Elliot Aronson, the king of cognitive dissonance theory, was such a joy for both of us. That book just had tremendous consequences and influence. I often say to people, being a writer, such an odd experience. It's like sending a message in a bottle and dropping it in the ocean. So you don't know if that bottle is going to land on shore. You don't know if somebody will find it. You don't know if they'll open the bottle and read the message. And then you don't know if they read the message, if they're going to say a few choice words to you or get the message. And there's, sort of all that process between writing and hearing from the people you've written it for. And for me, that was the most unexpected and gratifying aspect of writing a book. People tell you their stories or how your work has affected them. Sometimes sometimes they're not always pleased. Sometimes they wish to ventilate at you.
Yeah.
So it's reciprocal.
Mistakes Were Made is such a great title. Do you remember where that title came from?
It came from Elliot Aronson. We were trying to how to name this book about self-justification. And self-justification is a big, heavy word. Self-justification in everyday life, self-justification in your life, world, times, and those super long titles. And he said mistakes were made because we were all joking. It was the stupid semi-apology people were making at the time. It was very popular in the press. Mistakes were made. Yeah, we're not going to say who. And then he added, but not by me. And that summarized exactly what the theme of the book was going to be. It's what the journalist Robert Cheerleader called the past self-exonerative tense, which we really loved that one. And it was exactly right. Now, it came from Eliot in a spurt of genius.
How did you all get associated? Because I think you went to the same undergraduate institution, didn't you? Did you and Eliot?
Oh, we did. 12,
but
13.
It wasn't then, because there's distance between you.
We both went to Brandeis, but we met when I was a young editor at Psychology Today, and I was sent out to try to woo this famous, eminent person named Elliot Aronson into writing an article for the magazine. And we met at a conference, and I took him to dinner, and he said, sure, he'd write an article. Was our first grammatical argument in which he wanted to write an article on interpersonal attraction. That's what the field was called. I said, Elliot, interpersonal attraction is redundant. If you're attracted to someone, it's interpersonal. I mean, I suppose you could have intrapersonal attraction for narcissists, But anyway, so he loved writing, and he loved writing for the public too, as you know. And so I worked with him on that article for Psych Today. And just over time, we became fast friends and sharing this passion for writing for the public, as he did with The Social Animal, his social psych textbook. And then one day, after George Bush had decided to go into Iraq, we were sitting on his porch in Santa Cruz, and he said, I don't think most liberals think George Bush was, just truly, evil and intent and so forth and going into this war. He said, I don't think Bush was lying to the American people. I think he was lying to himself. What he was doing is just what all of us do. He had made the decision first to go into Iraq and then found the reasons to justify that decision. And to do that, he had to cherry pick the evidence that the intelligence community was giving him. And so he did. And we all believed that cherry picked evidence. And so as we got into this discussion, we thought, this is a really interesting book. I mean, it wasn't quite at the book theme yet, but we began talking about this idea because Eliot would contribute the science of cognitive dissonance. What it was for him, it was a joy to bring this concept that his mentor, Leon Festinger, had devised into the real world, something Festinger had no interest ever in doing. He was going to bring cognitive dissonance into the world, and the chapters would fit the kind of writing I had been doing and the kind of research I had been doing in real world issues like recovered memory syndrome and the criminal justice system, eyewitness testimony, marital quarrels and relationships, war and peace, and so forth. So we devised an outline for the book, wrote it up, and sold it for a healthy advance. And then on the day we got our contract from the publisher, Eliot called to say his macular degeneration, which he knew that he had, but it gave him some modest vision. It had bottomed out that day. And he said, so obviously I'm not going to be able to write this book with you. And I said, wrong. No, forget that. We're in this together or not at all. And we're going to find a way to do this. And this is the thing. We did. It was a fascinating collaboration because we would meet, discuss the topic of a chapter, what should be in it, what kinds of things, what point of view, what did we want to say, who was doing what research. Now, then I would go away and draft something perfectly dreadful. Then I would come back and read it to him. This was an amazing experience. And as I read, I would come to a paragraph. See, when you're reading things out loud, you cannot sneak a bad paragraph by the listener. They hear it. Okay? You do that when you're writing for yourself. Okay, I'll come back and fix that paragraph next year. No, right? When you're saying it out loud, there it is. And so he would say, what is this mess that you have written here? This is appalling. Anyway, then we would discuss it and revise it. Then I would go back and revise. So this process, because Eliot is a genius listener, in his many years of encounter group work and workshops, he's a consummate listener and could listen and edit brilliantly. And so it was a true collaboration in the best, most heartening sense. And out of this process of drafting, reading, and revising came the first edition of that book. And we've now got 3 editions of it. And it's just been an amazing experience. People still write to us and say things like, why didn't you have a chapter on dentists? Your book completely describes my experience as a dentist. The dentists won't admit they're wrong. What's the matter with them? It's universal,
Yeah. Where do you see, I know that you've also, like in your latest edition, you even added chapters. And maybe you could talk about that added chapter in 2020. But I bet these cycles you're talking about, it would just never end. I mean, this book would just continue to be written forever, right? This
is true. Eliot calls it the president of the edition. We had Bush, right? But right, there was no need to revise the book to update the concept or even its applicability. The second edition was interesting because, as you know, there are 2 ways to reduce dissonance. One is you justify your mistakes and wrong beliefs and bad choices, which is what most people do. But there are also consequences for people who cannot reduce dissonance. This is, they live with buyer's remorse or with regret or with self-recriminations or with guilt and suffering. We call this PTSD in many cases. I committed such horrible, horrible acts when I was in Vietnam, when I was in Iraq. I cannot tolerate myself. That inability to justify extreme harms or minor ones can be just as devastating for people. So I said to Eliot, maybe we want to do a chapter on the problem for people who cannot reduce dissonance. And he said, in the first edition, I didn't want to deal with them in any detail because I didn't want people getting off the hook. Okay, done, resolved, I'm fine now. He said, sometimes people really have to live in their dissonance if they're going to really accept how wrong they were about something or the harms they inflicted, and then think about what they can learn from that going forward. But in the second edition, we did want to spend some time on that issue for the people who suffer from not being able to reduce dissonance. And then, of course, the Trump chapter, dissonance, democracy, and the demagogue. And that was not a book, that was not a chapter, as some people thought, about Republicans versus Democrats. That's obvious. We understand that polarization. It was a chapter about Republicans versus Republicans. It was a chapter about how the Republicans who feared and loathed Trump from the beginning either accepted him and swallowed their dissonance about him, justified their decisions, or how over time some of them began to peel away from their devotion to him and the price that it cost them. And we wanted that example to show, well, just that, how difficult it is for people to change their minds along the way. I mean, if we were doing that chapter now, I would have an equally vivid example of the division among the left, between the left and the progressive left, on issues that are quite divisive. There are many issues on which I do not support the progressive left, and many of my colleagues and friends don't either, and we find ourselves homeless in terms of what candidates to support. So this is not just a matter of Democrat, Republican. It's the issues we all face about how to determine policy, how to determine whom to vote for, and when to be, quote, disloyal to a party, a religion, a country that we support. I grew up in the era of, when the Vietnam War dividing the country, and so it was love it or leave it, that the right wing would say. No, love it and improve it. Love it and improve it. And we see right now the war amongst Republicans. Well, it's not so much of a war amongst Republicans anymore, is it? But there you are.
Yeah. So obviously your work, and your writing has, again, these cyclical, important applications to what we are seeing in society. And yeah, maybe maybe Republicans or times of war or whatever, in other generations, maybe we were seeing it in the forefront, in the spotlight there. And now you're saying we're seeing it on the far left as well. Is it affiliation? People are seeing themselves as affiliated with one of these groups, and then it's just very hard for them to
think
independently.
It's a matter of identity and group affiliation. How strongly do you feel yourself to be a member of a political party or a religion or an ideology? I grew up with feminist parents whose notion of feminism is women should be able to do anything they want to do, and so when the rebirth of feminism occurred in the 60s and 70s, I was kind of already there, if you will. I didn't need any consciousness raising. My consciousness was arisen. Anyway, but at that time, the rise of feminism mid-century and in the 60s and 70s was obviously an ideological point of view, but it was, for me, I saw it as a correction to bad science. Science which had been based on the normal human male. This was the subject of my book, The Mismeasure of Woman. Took the male as the standard in medicine and law and science and so many other ways. And so what feminism was doing in those decades was, I saw it as a corrective to biased, narrow-minded science. If women and men were in a study and the women didn't behave the way the men did, there was something the matter with the women. It's like people said, oh, women have low self-esteem. Nobody said maybe men have excessive self-esteem. It's all in the interpretation of the finding. Over time, what came to concern me was, keeping in mind the goal was feminism in the service of better science, of improving our science. What happened was, in many circles, is that if the feminist notion was disconfirmed by evidence or science, well, then the hell with the science. Okay? You mean women don't make moral judgments the way men do? And there are many examples I could choose, but I remember in the mid 80s or so, I gave a speech at an international, see, this is the lecturer part. Yeah. I used to say lecturer or performance artist, I'm not sure which, but I gave a lecture at an international psychology meeting in which was called Psychology and Feminism, Good Intentions, Wrong Turns. And at the time, I identified concerns that were coming from the feminist movement that I felt were were running headlong into what the science said. So one was the notion of victim feminism. One was superiority feminism. It's not that women are worse than men. They're actually better than men, I don't want to repeat the nature of the talk here exactly, but it was my first effort to articulate concerns I was having about this relationship between feminism and science. And ever since, my view has been, of course, we need our ideologies. Of course, we need our passionate beliefs. Of course, we need the political commitments that make us feel grounded to the planet and to our fellows. They motivate us and they keep us engaged. But for me, the goal has always been to hold them lightly enough so that if you need to change your mind when the evidence dictates, you can. You will. You can say, gee, this was an idea that I thought was really true. I thought women were, just definitely kinder and more peaceful than men. Oh, look at this evidence. Oh, dear. Well, I guess maybe I'm wrong. Which you can see underlies, of course, mistakes were made. So therefore, when I find myself now in the last number of years being a person always on the left, on the liberal left, and when I find myself arguing with illiberal thinking to my left, I'm not going to be silenced about that either. I think it is often just as dangerous and pernicious as the illiberalism on the right. And I see it as our obligation to tell truth to power, whether the power is on the left or the right.
Yeah, has this been, and I'd like to actually hear some of these things from you about kind of what you're thinking the science is saying right now, and where you think we've maybe gone away from it. But first, a question: has this cost you to do this in your career?
This is the benefit of being an independent scholar. I mean, I will say seriously, I think that if I were now a university professor, I would share the self-censorship impulses of so many of my colleagues who feel they really cannot say what they want to say. They cannot report studies they want to report. That would be just devastating to me. I could not do that. And so my choice would be, it's hard for me to project this. The answer to your question is no, I have not personally suffered. But then you know what? I'm not on social media. I don't have to pay attention to people tweeting about what a terrible human I am. I let Michael Shermer at Skeptic tell me how they hate me or love me or whatever else. That's all I need to know. I want to say what I want to say, and I do have a platform. I'm lucky that I do. But do you know, when I wrote Anger all those bazillion years ago, there was a social psychologist who had determined the conditions under which the angry expression of anger will feel good and be beneficial. At the time, those conditions almost never existed in real life, but they were things like the target of your anger does not respond in kind. The target of your anger just says, oh, thanks for saying. Your anger is, an appropriate proportion to what the offense was, and blah, blah, blah. But the real killer condition was that your respondent does not get angry back at you. Okay? So what we see now in our country are people who, thanks to the internet, get to be anonymous in their venomous, angry, loathsome accusations and reactions. They have the immediacy of an instant feeling, instantly posted, instantly enraging and enraged. It was just exactly what a social psychologist would have predicted we would get, is an escalation of these angry kinds of outbursts. At the time, I remember writing to the great columnist Russell Baker, who was being snarky about the women's movement, and I was snarked at him, in that way. And I wrote him I wrote him a letter. That's how long ago this was. A letter. Think of that. I wrote him a letter in what I thought was devastatingly witty anger, explaining just why he was so terribly wrong. But as I said, it was quite snarky. So bless him, he sent my letter back to me, edited. He had written all over the margins. It was like I suddenly saw what I had said to him and completely understood in that moment why what I said was not going to fall on receptive ears. See, that's the thing we don't give ourselves now, that time between how can I communicate this so that my opponent will hear me, as opposed to how can I say this so that I can make him feel as bad as I want him to feel. So so I wrote back and I said, I see what I did. I apologize. That's not what I meant. And he replied, could this be the beginning of a beautiful and civilized correspondence? That's what we've lost, the beautiful civilized correspondence. To answer your question, fortunately for me, no, I have not had to suffer professionally. But I will say the other thing is that I'm now out of textbook writing and academic journal writing, where I don't think I'd have a home.
Right. Yeah. Now, I was looking back over some of the writing that you've done and the communication you've done about specific topics. I'm wondering if we can, we've already talked about anger and the acceptable kind of science, and I'm using that loosely at the time when did you put out anger in the mid 80s? Is that right?
Yeah.
80s. Yeah.
It was first 82 and then revised in 89.
Right. Okay. And that was like a new scientific model for anger expression. And then this turned into, when were therapy practices, false memories, all those sorts of things happening? And you sort of, I think, wrote about that as well.
Well, The Mismeasure of Woman was 92. That was a decade later. I seem to write a book every decade. And so The Mismeasure of Woman did end with a discussion about, at that time in the book, it was almost a tentative discussion. But see, once again, it was ideology versus science. Feminists were in Ms. Magazine, on the cover of its magazine, believe it, satanic ritual abuse of children. No, believe it? I'm supposed to believe it just because it's on the cover of a feminist magazine? No. And there was an enormous war among feminists on this question of whether to believe the courage to heal, and women going into therapy and coming out having recovered the memories that their father or uncle or somebody had molested them for 20 years, only they forgot. This was a massive moral hysterical epidemic in our country, and it caused, hundreds of families divided and at war and lawsuits, and what it took, along with, by the way, from the 80s, the daycare sex abuse hysteria.
Yes.
Which lingers. There are still people daycare workers in jail on the testimony of 3-year-olds saying, ridiculous things. And mistakes were made, actually. Elliot and I were talking one day about how we both had tended to believe the McMartin case in 1984 in Los Angeles, in which this daycare, the family running this daycare center were suddenly being accused of horrific acts by the children in their care, although nobody had ever noticed anything. Parents were walking in and out of the place for decades. And Elliot said this wonderful sentence. I said, we're putting it in the book right now. He said, we sacrificed our skepticism on the altar of outrage. And we did. And I did. And so that lesson really stuck with me.
I really like this quote by Eliot. It for me, it continues to give voice to what we are doing here. There is so much outrage, and there is, I think it's interesting that you, probably for compassion reasons, were outraged at this idea that something like this could be happening at a daycare, and that grabs our emotions, and then the emotions, I think, grab our beliefs at that point.
Of course they do. In Mistakes Were Made, we have this paradigm called the pyramid of choice, which I think was really an inspired metaphor because many people understand it immediately. If you start out at the very top of a pyramid, let's say, with a kind of mezzo notion about something, should I believe his story or her story, some sensational story in the news? Is he lying? Is she lying? Who's lying? Somebody's got to be lying. Or should I cheat or should I not cheat? Or whatever the decision is, that's when we're going to be at our most open-minded about making a choice. But the minute we make a decision, she's guilty, he's guilty, we will then have to put our decision in consonance with our belief. So if I spontaneously cheat, I now have to decide cheating is not such a bad crime. If I resist cheating, I have to say, you know what? I feel good to have integrity and not cheating. Now, so what happens, and of course, all you have to do is have the words children and sex in the same sentence, and people completely lose their brain cells. The end of discussion. And so what happened was everybody just leapt off that pyramid in the direction of those daycare workers must be guilty. And then once you've done that, it becomes very difficult to go back up and say, you know what, that original impulse I had was wrong. I need to correct myself. I've now spent weeks, months, years invested in a decision or a course of action or a belief that I thought was reasonable. Over time, I kept adding more justifications for the rightness of that choice. And now you're telling me I'm wrong? Oh, sod off, So.
Well, and as a social psychologist, you better than anyone, I'm not a social psychologist, but you better than anyone understand that
it's not too late, Garth. It's not too late. You can still do a course correction on that. Yes.
The pressure, the group pressure to come along and say, guilty, or to say I'm in, or to stand against something like that, or to stand skeptically against something like that seems unkind, Yes. And it's like the group will hold you responsible if you don't join them in that moment, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is why, for many people, as they watch a beloved organization change in ways they don't approve, they have to decide, do I just conform or do I leave? Or do I speak up and then get thrown out? That is why these decisions are as much moral and ethical as social psychological, but people certainly need to understand that the price of dissent is large because the group doesn't welcome whistleblowers. It doesn't like dissenters. It's not happy that somebody is raising an issue that I didn't think of and that I should have. And, we are seeing ever more people being canceled, expelled, thrown out. I just reviewed Greg Lukianoff and Ricky Schlatt's book, The Canceling of the American Mind. Mm-hmm. And there are now way, way, way too many of these kinds of cases, which is desperately concerning that this is happening at our universities where different points of view are, not just different points of view, but evidence that contradicts your assumption of what racism is, or if so-and-so is racist or not racist, and all of these allegations don't give me this evidence that disputes my belief. That's
yeah. I appreciated the article that you wrote. I think it was called "The Ghost of Joe McCarthy," right?
Yeah.
And where did you write that? In case folks want to find that, where was that?
It's in the TLS, the Times Literary Supplement, which is an English paper, although also available here, but without a payroll, without a payroll, she said, without a paywall. It's also going to appear in Skeptic magazine in their April issue.
Okay, so the people will see it there. I think, psychologists, I don't know, maybe not, but I think psychologists have long appreciated Skeptic magazine, and we try to teach our students to have healthy skepticism from just a scientific literacy perspective, critical thinking perspective. I don't quite know what's happening in the academy right now. I think you have some opinions on it, but it seems like there is a lot of pressure, and people like their jobs,
Do they? I'm curious.
Actually, I'm not sure that's true. Sometimes people don't like their jobs, but they maybe like stability or don't like change or something like that. But yeah, there's a lot going on right now, and it's so interesting how much of it really does come down to some level of cognitive dissonance and how we can justify things, and how, I guess even scientists can justify certain things.
Right. I mean, science, look at the fundamental nature of what the scientific method is, a way of making us face the evidence that we could be wrong. No wonder it's not popular. Who wants this? Wait, you've been working for 7 years on this thing, and look, it's not working out. Are you going to? No, wait, one more experiment, one more thing. When Carol Wade and I did our introductory psychology textbook now so many years ago, she had signed the contract to do this book and then realized the whole textbook by herself would be rather daunting. So I said, well, what's your goal in this book? She said, well, first of all, I want to make introductory psychology more than about men. I don't want to have, there used to be a chapter called gender. That's where you put the women. No, I'm going to mainstream women into the intro psych book. Also, culture. Biology is one bookend, but culture is the other bookend, and we need both of these bookends for a true study of the human being. And mainly, I want to teach students how to think critically, because the findings in psychology will change. But if you can understand what critical thinking even means, you can take that with you. Then we realized, after an edition or two, that everybody was taking critical to mean negative. She was critical of that movie. No, no, that's not its essence. So we began calling it critical and creative thinking, because the goal is not just to debunk something, but to put a better belief in its place. And then, then we had developed the key ingredients of critical thinking, which we really enjoyed, and we were part of the critical thinking movement and so forth. And then we realized in psychology had a different chance as well, which is not just to show how to think critically, but why we don't. Why we don't. What are the obstacles to thinking critically that are built into the human mind? All the biases, the confirmation bias and the hindsight bias and so forth. And so we thought those are really the two pillars of understanding that we would hope to convey to students. There's a joy in critical and creative thinking because you come up with something better. Isn't that a good thing? Well, no, not if it takes away a belief that I hold dear to my heart.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a really kind of nice way to wrap up this section. But if you open the door to the Wade Tavris textbook, so I want to talk about that a little bit, because that was my first introduction to you was, looking at your textbook. I didn't know you don't know who these people are. Who's Wade? Who's Tavris? You don't even know what gender they are. You have no idea about them. They're just names, but your textbook is still having a very good run. And how many editions did you do of it? And you did 2 versions, right?
Yes, 2 versions. Well, that was the general procedure in textbook publishing. There's sort of the main version, and then there's a shorter, more paperback version and so forth. Carol and I did 12 editions, and now we have 2 co-authors who have basically taken over the project. So the book continues. Our publishers know Wade Tavris is a brand, and people love it for what it still does. So they do the updating and adding new material and so forth. So it lives on. We began this book. Yeah, I got 13 editions. Yeah. And we just loved it. We loved doing it. We loved the process. One of the delicate issues for textbook writers is that very often we have to learn about latest cutting edge information that teachers don't know. Okay. And we all know the struggle for teachers. You've got lessons and you've got lectures and you don't want to change things. And I've done this way. So you have to find a way to gently explain. You have to say gently in a book, okay, why is Carol Gilligan's view that men and women reason differently in their moral reasoning? This was a hugely popular idea. It was so flattering to women. Women make moral judgments based on compassion and care, and men make moral judgments based on reason and logic. And by the way, how many women lawyers said, I hate that theory. That's just stupid. That makes me, as a lawyer, I don't reason morally with logic and reason. Piss off. So Carol Gilligan's hugely popular book was hugely popular and wrong. And as the evidence began rolling in on how wrong it was and how her ideas came about because she knew whether it was a girl or a boy answering a moral reasoning question. So now here we are. We have to cover this in the book. What are we supposed to do? So that was one of many examples where you tell the history of the idea. Here was an idea. Here was somebody remedying the problem of women's exclusion from moral reasoning, research, and theory. Coming up with this idea wasn't that exciting. Everybody liked this idea. And then here's the next step. As happens in research, you have an idea, a hypothesis, you do the research. Does this hold up or not? So I think that's why our book became known as being so reliable as a resource for what we now know and what we might need to change our views about.
It's such an interesting example because I think that I know some introductory psychology textbook authors, and they have difficulties sometimes getting rid of. I think there's one way to do it. You tell the story of it and you integrate it as part of the story, or you say, listen, this is not relevant anymore, and we need to cut pages anyway, so we'll just remove this. Well, readers don't love that because they teach that. Mm-hmm. So any reviewers come along and say, I actually like that theory.
Yeah. Eric Erickson, you chucked Eric Erickson, but I love Eric Erickson. I love this stage. Yeah. No, right. Well, no, that's absolutely true. It's always a battle between cutting pages to add new material. If you've got to add new material, something's got to be cut. Books are big enough anyway. And it's true. Yes, that is always one of the delicate dances that must be done. Sometimes we did it just by shrinking the amount of space devoted to an idea that was simply no longer really relevant, as you just said. But if it's something that everybody knows and expects, then it's the author's more or less obligation to address it, if only to say, sorry. I mean, well, of course, the biggest one of all was Freud. Freud used to dominate intro psych books. Dwindle, dwindling,
Yeah.
Dwindling, I mean, the last 50 years have shown an immense move away from Freudian notions of things, and we endlessly had this discussion, but Freudian ideas are so much a part of culture. Repression, and projection and, goodness, repression underlaid the whole recovered memory idea that you repress a traumatic experience and it's buried in there like a turnip and we got to dig it out later and so forth. Well, without knowing the origin of that notion of repression, it wouldn't be very clear. So, those ideas are the are the Dracula of psychological theories. You cannot kill them except with a stake through their heart. Even then, they just live on. They live on.
Yeah, and I think that is it. It reminds me what you just said. It reminds me of the rest of our conversation. Is that bad ideas continue on, even in the face of evidence, for many different reasons.
Money being one. Many people build very successful practices, therapies, interventions. That's their living. That's their living.
I was doing an interview for, we have a first year kind of college 101 class at my college. And I don't know any of these students, but they reached out to me and they said, hey, we're all interested in doing psychology someday. Would you take 15 minutes and just chat with us about psychology? And so I met them like this on a Zoom call. And these freshmen were asking me about psychology. And I just on a whim, I was just like, I said, well, let me give you an example. A lot of people have ideas about psychology that are untrue. They're like myths. I said, one of them that often happens in education is called learning styles. And you've probably heard this before, that if we match a student's learning style to a teacher's teaching style, that student will learn better with that matched style. Turns out there is not any evidence for that. And yet, lots of people continue to believe that there is. And these students started laughing. And I said, why? They all started giggling. I said, why are you laughing? They said, that was our lesson in this class yesterday. was on learning styles. And I was like, okay, I still have work to do.
I got work. Oh, yeah, you do. Oh, yeah, you do. Well, see, there you go.
Yeah, they get their hooks into us, into our systems, into our whatever culture, education, ideas like this, and they just don't let go. There are very active websites and organizations that are still saying this is a great thing. This is a great way to educate your students.
Give me a gimmick. Give me a gimmick. There's room for a new one.
Well, with that, I think I will let you go today. I really appreciate how you have sometimes pushed psychological science into the consciousness of the general public. You're still doing it. I read that article. It was very, very thoughtful. I look back over your career. It's just what you've done. I'm so glad your voice is also in the intro psych world, because what you and Carol Wade did with critical thinking, I think, is just a gift. I think it's actually rippled out into the other intro psych textbooks and into the curriculum as well. I know you're smiling. I hope that makes you happy, because it makes me happy. So anyway, thank you for the time. Thanks for just what you continue to do. Continue to keep us honest, would you?
Oh, I'll do my best, and myself as well. But thank you for this opportunity to have a reflection on where I've been, maybe where I'm going, and for your enthusiastic support of these important ideas in psychology. I'm very much appreciate our conversation. Thank you.
This was very, very nice. And we do want to thank Ludi Benjamin for making this connection. As you know, I also just had a recent opportunity to chat with Elliot Aronson. You and even people I have just talked to and said, hey, I'm going to interview Carol Tavris. I just want you to know that you've left a wonderful legacy with our friends and in the teaching of psychology community. And you are well appreciated out here. So thanks for everything.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Psych Sessions can do what it does because of listeners like you. We want to thank you for your support over the years in our mission to get more free professional development to all teachers of psychology around the world. If you want to support us further by making a tax-deductible donation, please head to psychsessions.org/donations. Thanks for listening.